2.1 and 2.175 billion. Does anyone have any idea what these numbers mean? Well, I'll tell you that these numbers are not some sort of secret code or mathematical calculation. These numbers are more the result of a miscalculation, a grave miscalculation on the part of the Brazilian government in reducing their carbon emissions. These numbers represent the carbon equivalent emission levels in Brazil for 2005 and 2019. You see, the big problem here lies in how similar these two numbers are, considering that Brazil promised to reduce their emissions by 37% from their 2000 levels by 2025 and 43% by 2030 as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. With their absolute pledge to reduce emissions, this means that Brazil must reduce annual carbon emissions to 1.32 billion tons by 2025 and 1.19 billion tons by 2030.
Hello, my name is Sam Tullis, and I am a student here at the University of Washington. I have spent the past month researching Brazil's climate impact, economy, and government. Through this process, I have learned much about the current economic and political state of the country. I have also learned much about the carbon tax and cap and trade carbon pricing systems and the trade-off implications of their use in Brazil. Today, I will describe these trade-off implications for these carbon pricing solutions and how they could help Brazil reduce its carbon footprint. First, I will give a brief overview of a carbon tax system, then describe its strengths and weaknesses in Brazil. Next, I will do the same for cap and trade, then conclude with a helpful analogy and a few key takeaways. A carbon tax is a carbon pricing system that generally consists of a carbon levy on fossil fuels and an output-based pricing system. The carbon levy charges the producers and distributors for each ton of CO2 that they emit. An output-based price system sets a benchmark level of emissions, and companies that release lower than this benchmark receive savable and sellable surplus credits. Now we will dive into what a carbon tax would look like in Brazil. One strength of this system is that it requires less administrative effort and supervision to be successful. This makes a carbon tax more easy to pass into legislation. This is useful because Brazil has been undergoing political instability and corruption over recent years, which can be seen on this timeline. In 2016, former President Dilma Rousseff was removed from office. In 2018, another former president was imprisoned. In 2018, Bolsonaro was also elected, which led to the rollback of climate policies and less focus on climate change. Another strength is the output-based price system, which alleviates the financial impact of the tax for large emitters through delaying tax payments to the end of each next year instead of a monthly payment basis. It also can reduce carbon leakage through credit trading. One weakness of a carbon tax in Brazil is that the actual reduction in carbon emissions depends on supply and demand. Because of recent economic decline, which can be seen in this graph, it looks like Brazil will not return to its pre-pandemic economic growth rates until at least the end of 2022. This makes it more unlikely that a carbon tax will be adapted, since sufficient carbon reduction is not guaranteed. Another weakness is that the increase in cost is easily noticeable to both businesses and the public. Because of this, businesses and the public would be more against adapting a carbon tax with the current economy, especially since businesses would probably pass the cost of the tax down to consumers. A cap and trade system sells emission allowances and quarterly auctions to emitters, which can then be traded in a free market dependent on different companies' carbon emission needs. Now we are looking at what a cap and trade system would look like in Brazil. One strength of cap and trade is that the government is able to set the number of emission allowances. This is good for Brazil because this allows Brazil to reduce the number of allowances each year until carbon emission levels are close to or meet the Paris Climate Agreement targets. This is definitely useful because it gives the government more definitive control over how much carbon reduction is actually occurring. Another strength is that this system provides free credits to energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. This prevents carbon leakage of the emissions to other countries, which can help Brazil effectively and easily reduce their carbon footprint. The secondary trading market with other countries is another strength that can be especially useful to Brazil by creating more competitive prices for trading, emission allowances, and the ability to buy more offset credits from another country if necessary. One weakness of this system is that it requires a lot of administrative effort and supervision to be successful, with many people being hired to audit and complete calculations for the system. This would be difficult to achieve in Brazil with the recent political instability, change of administration, and economic decline that were explained earlier. This makes the successful management of such an extensive carbon pricing system highly unlikely. Another weakness is that the increased cost of carbon can go unnoticed by the general public, since most of the impact of the cost falls on producers and how efficiently companies can trade their emission allowances. This means that the general public's consumption of goods will remain relatively unchanged.
Also, the total cost of the system is unknown, which is not ideal for Brazil since the country is still emerging from economic decline. A successful carbon pricing system is like an iguana. Native to Brazil, an iguana adapts to be successful through changing color based off of its surrounding environment. Similar to this, a successful carbon pricing system also has to be adapted to fit the specific political and economic environment that it is being implemented in. Keeping this in mind, there are certain trade-off implications associated with the adaptation of either system in Brazil. A carbon tax is easier to pass, however, is more economically risky. A cap and trade system would be harder to successfully manage, but would be less economically taxing and potentially more effective towards reducing carbon emissions in time to meet Brazil's climate agreement goals. Thank you for listening. I hope that the information presented today helped you better understand the trade-off implications of these carbon pricing systems in Brazil.